What would you do if one quiet afternoon you found a little girl crying at your son's grave and realized she wasn't a stranger, but the daughter of your former maid? For billionaire Charles Whitmore, that moment shattered his pride and uncovered a truth buried deeper than loss itself. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? The morning air carried the faint chill of late October when Charles Whitmore stepped out of his car and into the quiet of Oakwood Cemetery. The wind moved slowly between the maple trees, rustling through golden leaves that clung to the last warmth of autumn. His chauffeur, Walter Jenkins, offered to stay close, but Charles waved him off. "Give me a moment," he said, his voice low, cracked by years of silence rather than age. He walked the familiar path past rows of marble stones, his polished shoes crunching over leaves that seemed too loud in that hush. For years, he had visited the grave of his son, Captain Michael Whitmore, but never with ease, always with guilt. He used to arrive with flowers and a schedule, staying no longer than 15 minutes before retreating to the cold comfort of his car. But that morning felt different. The air was softer, the sun filtered gently through branches, and for the first time, he lingered. The headstone was simple: "Beloved son and soldier." Beneath it, someone had placed a wooden bird, small, hand-carved, its wings slightly uneven but graceful. Charles frowned. It wasn't there before. He crouched, running his thumb along the grain. The carving was rough, the kind a child might make. He looked around. The cemetery was nearly empty, except for an old groundskeeper raking leaves near the gate. He turned the little bird over, noticing faint initials scratched into its underside. "G.B." His chest tightened. Who would leave something like this here? A voice broke the silence. "Mister, please don't take that. It's mine." Charles turned sharply. A little girl stood a few steps away, clutching a bunch of dandelions. She couldn't have been more than 7. Her light brown hair fell in soft curls, her cheeks pink from the cold. She wore a worn red sweater and sneakers that looked one size too big. He straightened, unsure how to respond. "Yours?" She nodded solemnly. "My daddy's bird. I made it for him." Her words struck like a forgotten echo. For a moment, Charles couldn't speak. The child stepped closer, setting the flowers at the base of the same headstone he had been visiting. "You knew him?" he managed. She looked up at him, eyes the color of faded green glass. "He's my daddy, Michael Bennett. Mommy says he was a hero." Charles froze. His heart began to pound as if the name itself had claws. "Michael Bennett?" he whispered, confused. The headstone read Michael Whitmore. He must have misheard. But no. The girl said it again, softly, pressing her fingers to the engraved letters. "Mommy says we couldn't afford a new stone, so we keep this one for him. She says God won't mind the name being wrong if the heart remembers right." Something cracked open in him, something old, rigid, now trembling. He glanced back at his car. Walter was waiting respectfully by the gate. "And where's your mother?" he asked carefully. "At work," she said. "She cleans houses. I just came to talk to Daddy. I told Mommy I'd be quick." "You came here alone?" She nodded, brushing a leaf from the stone. "It's okay, mister." "Jacobs, the man who cuts the grass, watches me sometimes." Charles crouched again, the stiffness of age and regret tugging at his knees. "You carved this bird yourself?" The girl smiled, showing a small gap where her front tooth was missing. "Mommy helped a little. Daddy liked birds. He said they mean freedom." The word freedom made his throat tighten. It was something Michael had written once, long ago, in a letter Charles never answered. He studied the girl's small hands, the same gentle curve of fingers his son had. "You're a very brave little girl," he said finally. "What's your name?" "Grace," she replied. He repeated it quietly, like testing a fragile memory. "Grace." Her voice softened. "What's your name, mister?" For a moment, he didn't know how to answer. The man he used to be, the one who worked through grief with meetings and money, would have simply walked away. But here, standing before his son's grave with this child, he felt something shift. "Charles," he said finally. "My name's Charles." Grace looked at him curiously, then smiled again, a shy, forgiving smile that made his heart stumble. "You look sad," she said simply. He tried to smile back. "Maybe I am." She picked up her wooden bird and brushed off a speck of dirt. My daddy says sad people need stories, she whispered, then placed it back on the stone. Do you want to tell me yours? Charles swallowed. The cemetery around them felt suspended the city beyond its gates, forgotten. The bells from a nearby church tolled softly in the distance, marking noon. He hesitated, looking at the sky, pale blue, gentle, unjudging. Not today, he said quietly. Maybe another time. Grace nodded as if she understood. That's okay. I'll be here again. And in 10. He watched her skip away toward the cemetery gate, the red of her sweater glowing against the fading leaves. When she disappeared beyond the trees, Charles turned back to the grave. His hand rested on the headstone, trembling slightly. Michael, he whispered, what did I do? The wind answered with silence and the soft rattle of wooden wings. Charles remained kneeling before the stone, his breath fogging lightly in the crisp air. He traced the carved letters of his son's name, the granite cold beneath his fingertips. For the first time in years, he did not think of the boardroom, of deadlines, or of the mansion standing silent on the hill. He thought of a boy running barefoot through the yard, laughing, chasing pigeons, before time and pride had turned laughter into distance. He sat back on the damp grass, his gray suit wrinkled, but he didn't care. The wooden bird caught the sunlight and threw a small reflection across the marble. Grace's little creation uneven, imperfect, alive. He tried to imagine his son's life after the war. What if Michael had survived? Would he have built birdhouses with a daughter who carved like that? Would he have forgiven his father for the harsh words before deployment? He pressed a hand over his eyes. Freedom, Michael had written in that last letter. For you, Dad. I hope someday you find it too. End of. The memory stung. Charles had locked that letter away in a desk drawer, unopened for years. He couldn't bear the handwriting, the hope that no longer had a voice. And now, standing before a child who claimed the same grave, something inside him whispered that the past had not been buried as deeply as he believed. Sir? Walter's voice came from a respectful distance. We should get going. The meeting downtown, there won't be a meeting today, Charles said, still facing the grave. Cancel everything. Walter hesitated. Yes, sir. Charles rose slowly, brushing the dirt from his trousers. His knees protested, but his heart felt heavier still. He looked around the cemetery, the rows of stones, the old maples, the silence that seemed too full. Then his gaze caught a small figure at the far gate. Grace had stopped and was waving. Her smile lit up the gray of the afternoon. He lifted a hand in return, awkwardly, like a man relearning a forgotten gesture. She turned and ran toward the street, where an older man, the groundskeeper, perhaps was waiting with a rake over his shoulder. The scene, ordinary as it was, struck him as sacred. On the drive back, Charles sat in silence. Walter kept the radio off. The car's interior smelled faintly of leather and cologne, but beneath it, Charles could almost smell the cold air from the cemetery, the scent of damp leaves and wood polish from that little bird. Everything all right, sir? Walter finally asked. Charles's voice came out softer than he expected. Tell me, Walter, do you believe people can come back from their mistakes? The older man glanced in the mirror. I believe folks try, sir. That's the part that counts. Charles nodded faintly, looking out at the skyline as they entered downtown Chicago. Skyscrapers gleamed like steel memorials to ambition. He had built half of them, yet none carried warmth. At the next red light, he saw a mother and daughter crossing the street, the child skipping, holding her mother's hand. The sight made his chest ache. When he returned home, the grand Whitmore estate felt emptier than ever. The fountain was still, the garden untrimmed. He walked through the marble foyer, past portraits of men who looked stern and successful but never kind. In the study, he poured himself a glass of scotch but left it untouched. His reflection in the window stared back a man with everything, except the one thing that mattered. He sat down at the old mahogany desk, unlocked a drawer, and took out the letter he'd kept hidden for nearly a decade. The paper had yellowed, the ink slightly faded. His son's handwriting slanted gently across the page. Dad, I know we don't see eye to eye, but I still believe we'll understand each other someday. If I don't make it home, remember, life isn't about what you build, it's about who you build it with. The words blurred as tears finally came, slow and unfamiliar. Charles folded the letter carefully and looked toward the window again. Outside, The last light of day spilled over Lake Michigan, and the city glowed beneath it, cold, beautiful, distant. In that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the need to move, to find out who that little girl really was. Maybe she was mistaken, maybe not. But the sound of her voice, "My daddy says sad people need stories," echoed in his head like a promise. He stood, slid the letter into his coat pocket, and walked toward the door. Walter was waiting in the hall, hat in hand. "Sir, shall I prepare the car?" "Not tonight," Charles said, "but soon. I need to visit Englewood." Walter blinked, surprised. "That's the South Side, sir." "Yes," Charles replied quietly. "I think that's where the story begins." Outside, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the stone path. From the study window, the wooden bird still seemed to gleam faintly in his mind's eye, a fragile sign carved by small hands, left on a soldier's grave to remind a man that some things could still be mended. And for the first time in many years, Charles Whitmore felt the faint stirring of something he had almost forgotten hope. The next morning broke gray and damp, the kind of Chicago morning when the city seemed to hold its breath. A thin mist curled along the streets, softening the hard edges of brick buildings and the steady hum of early traffic. Charles Whitmore sat at the kitchen counter of his mansion, untouched toast beside a mug of cooling coffee. The newspaper lay folded in half, unread. His mind wasn't on the markets or the mergers. It was still at Oakwood Cemetery, beside a wooden bird and a girl named Grace. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, that small face under the falling leaves. The way she said, "My daddy's bird." Her words had not just touched him. They had unsettled the quiet architecture of his guilt. After all these years, he had learned to keep grief behind closed doors. But that child had opened them with a single look. When Walter entered the room, polished and ready for the day, Charles was already standing by the window. "We're not going to the office today," he said without turning. Walter blinked. "Sir?" "I need to find someone," Charles said. "A woman. Her name might be Laura Bennett. She has a daughter named Grace." Walter hesitated. "Would you like me to call Mr. Ross?" Charles nodded once. "Yes. Tell him I need discretion and speed." By noon, a man in his 40s arrived at the Whitmore estate. Evan Ross had worked with Charles for years, a private investigator with the calm patience of someone who had seen too many human secrets. He greeted his client with a firm handshake and a polite, "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore. You don't usually call for personal matters." "This one is," Charles replied. "I met a little girl at Oakwood Cemetery. Said her father was Michael Bennett, but the grave she visited was my son's." Evan's brow furrowed. "Bennett? That's an alias or a mistake. You think she might be related to?" "I don't know," Charles said sharply, then softened. "Just find her. I need to understand." The detective took a seat, opening his small notebook. "You said she mentioned her mother cleans houses. That narrows it to a few neighborhoods. Englewood, maybe back of the yards." Charles's expression flickered. "Englewood?" he murmured. "She said her mother worked there." "Oh, then I'll start there," Evan said. "Any idea what she looks like?" Charles described the child, her light brown hair, her red sweater, her voice soft but sure. He surprised himself by remembering every detail. When he finished, Evan nodded and stood. "I'll be in touch within a day or two." When the door closed, silence returned. Charles moved to the fireplace and stared at the fading embers. Englewood. The name alone carried weight. He hadn't been to the South Side in decades, not since before the company bought up land for a development that had displaced hundreds of families. Michael had protested at the time, furious about the injustice. Charles had called him naive. They hadn't spoken again before Michael enlisted. He sighed, pressing a hand against his chest. "I drove people out," he whispered to himself, "and now I can't even find one child." End quote. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, cutting the room into pale gold and shadow. Charles picked up the phone twice, then set it down again. He didn't know what he would say to anyone, not his lawyers, not his friends, not even the chaplain who had buried his son. Words like forgiveness and family felt foreign on his tongue. That evening, the call came. Evan's voice was low but clear. "I found her, Mr. Whitmore. The girl's name is Grace Bennett. She lives with her mother, Laura Bennett, at 214 South Hoyne Avenue, Englewood District. The mother works part-time cleaning houses near Hyde Park." Charles's heart thudded. "And the father?" Evan hesitated. There's no record of a Michael Bennett, but the birth certificate lists father, unknown. The child's age matches. About 7. Charles sank into his armchair, gripping the phone. 7, he repeated softly. His son had died 8 years ago. Sir, Evan continued carefully, there's something else. The mother once worked as a live-in maid in a mansion on Lakeview Avenue, the Whitmore estate. The silence between them deepened. Charles felt his throat tighten. She worked here? For 7 years, according to employment records. Left shortly after your son's death. He could barely breathe. Fragments of memory returned a quiet woman, polite, always in the background. She would bring tea, tidy the study, and vanish without a sound. He remembered once overhearing Michael's voice in the hall, low and urgent, arguing with someone. Could it have been her? Do you want me to contact her? Evan asked. No, Charles said quickly. Not yet. After the call ended, he sat in the dim light for a long while, listening to the soft tick of the grandfather clock. He poured another coffee, forgetting to drink it. The revelation felt like both a wound and an answer. If Grace was truly Michael's child, it meant his bloodline lived on, but so did his failures. When Walter returned to check on him, Charles was still by the window, looking out at the drizzle that had begun to fall. Everything all right, sir? He turned slightly, his voice quiet. Do you believe in second chances, Walter? The old chauffeur smiled faintly. I think God keeps handing them out, sir. We're just slow to take them. Charles nodded, the faintest of smiles touching his lips. Then maybe it's time I learned to take one. He looked back at the rain-streaked glass. The reflection that stared back at him no longer looked like the man who had buried his feelings years ago. Somewhere in Englewood, a little girl with her father's smile was living proof that the past hadn't disappeared. It was waiting to be acknowledged. He reached into his pocket and touched the folded letter, now worn soft at the edges. Michael's words echoed again. Life isn't about what you build. It's about who you build it with. Outside, thunder rolled softly over the city. Charles turned from the window and said quietly, almost to himself, Tomorrow, I'm going to find them. The next morning, Chicago wore a coat of rain. Water traced silver lines down the office windows as Charles's car pulled away from the mansion and merged into the slow pulse of traffic heading south. Walter drove carefully, the windshield wipers keeping time like a quiet metronome. Neither man spoke for a while. Charles sat with a folded paper on his lap, Evan's report, typed and clipped neatly. A photograph was attached. A modest brick building with peeling paint, a tiny porch, and a mailbox that leaned slightly to one side. He imagined Grace's small hands dropping a letter there, her mother watching from behind the curtain. As they passed under the overpass into Englewood, the city's brightness faded. Storefronts were shuttered, graffiti bloomed across walls, and the air smelled faintly of rain and fried food. Children splashed through puddles, laughing as they chased one another along the sidewalk. For a moment, Charles envied them their unguarded joy. Sir, Walter said quietly, we're close. The car stopped a block away from the address. Charles didn't want to draw attention with the glossy black sedan, so he told Walter to wait. Pulling his coat collar up, he stepped out into the drizzle. The pavement glistened, slick and uneven. He walked slowly toward the small brick building. Through one window, he saw the faint glow of a lamp and the silhouette of someone moving inside a woman, maybe in her 30s, her figure thin but graceful. A child's laughter drifted faintly through the rain. He hesitated at the gate, uncertain what he was doing there. After years of commanding men and making decisions worth millions, he found himself afraid of a knock on a stranger's door. Excuse me, came a voice behind him. An older woman in a headscarf was standing under an umbrella, groceries in hand. She looked at him with curiosity. You looking for Laura? She just went out to the corner store. Sweet woman, hard worker. Charles managed a polite nod. Thank you. I knew her husband. The woman tilted her head. Husband? She never said much about him, only that he died overseas. Her words sank into him like stones. He wanted to ask more, but his throat felt tight. I appreciate your help, he said softly. He stepped back, retreating toward the car. Walter opened the door without a word, reading the turmoil on his face. Once inside, Charles stared at the raindrops racing down the glass. She lives modestly, he murmured. Yes, sir, Walter replied. Good people often do. Charles let out a slow breath. She worked for me once. I didn't even remember her. Walter said nothing, just kept his eyes on the road as they began the drive north again. After a while, Charles spoke quietly. Evan said the girl's father isn't listed. No name. That doesn't mean there wasn't love, sir, Walter said gently. The words lingered. They reached the bridge that overlooked the river, and for the first time, Charles noticed how the city lights shimmered on the water, soft and forgiving. He realized that all the buildings he had raised, all the monuments to his success, had never reflected anything this human. Back home, he went straight to the library. The rain had eased, leaving a pale wash of light across the shelves. He sat at the desk, pulled open the drawer, and took out a small wooden box he hadn't opened in years. Inside lay a stack of old photographs of his wife before she passed, his son in uniform, smiling beside a younger woman whose face he had forgotten until now. Laura, her hair was longer then, her eyes bright. She stood beside Michael at a garden party on the lawn, holding a tray of drinks, but the way he looked at her wasn't the way one looked at a servant. Charles felt the truth rising slowly, inevitably, like dawn. He leaned back in his chair, pressing a hand over his face. "So this is what you were hiding, Michael," he whispered. "You loved her. The weight of it, the secrecy, the shame, the consequence crushed him. If he had known, would things have been different? Would his pride have softened? His heart less guarded? He would never know. The phone rang, startling him. It was Evan again. "Mr. Whitmore, I have one more thing. Laura's behind on rent. She's been cleaning offices at night, taking care of the girl during the day. It's not my place, but she could use a little help." Charles closed his eyes. "Send me her landlord's name," quietly. "Yes, sir." After the call, he sat for a long time, the letter still in his pocket, the photograph open before him. He didn't know what the next step would be, only that he couldn't turn away now. Outside, the sun broke weakly through the clouds, catching on the raindrops still clinging to the glass. They glittered like small blessings, brief but real. Charles rose, straightened his coat, and looked out toward the horizon where the city began to glow again. Somewhere beyond those streets, a little girl had brought him face to face with everything he'd lost and perhaps everything he still had a chance to mend. He whispered to the empty room, "Michael, your daughter's alive, and I'll find a way to make things right. M." The echo of his voice faded into the hush of the house, leaving behind only the quiet ticking of the old clock and the faint, steady beat of rain starting once more against the window. The next day, sunlight broke through the gray clouds as if the city itself wanted to offer a fragile beginning. Charles Whitmore stood outside 214 South Hoyne Avenue, the paper with the address trembling slightly in his hand. He had told Walter to wait 2 streets away. This was something he had to do alone. The building was old but cared for. Fresh laundry fluttered from a balcony, and the faint smell of pancakes drifted from an upstairs window. Children's laughter echoed from a yard nearby. For years, Charles had lived in penthouses and marble foyers, yet nothing about those places had ever felt alive like this small corner of Inglewood. He drew a slow breath, straightened his coat, and climbed the worn wooden steps. The paint was chipped, the railing cold beneath his palm. At the door he hesitated. What could he possibly say? "Hello, I might be your child's grandfather?" The thought felt absurd, but the pull in his chest was stronger than reason. He lifted his hand to knock, just as the door opened from the inside. A woman stood there mid-30s, hair pulled back, a few strands falling loose around a tired but striking face. Her eyes, dark hazel and wary, widened when she saw him. "Mr. Whitmore?" she whispered, disbelief and fear colliding in her voice. Charles's breath caught. "Laura," he said quietly. "You remember me." Her hand tightened on the doorframe. "Of course I do. You shouldn't be here." "I needed to see you," he replied. "And the child." Laura's shoulders stiffened. "You mean Grace?" He nodded. "She was at my son's grave. She said her father was—" "Michael," she finished for him, voice breaking. "Your son." The world seemed to narrow around that single admission. Behind her, the room smelled faintly of soap and coffee. A child's drawing hung on the wall, bright crayon wings. A brown bird in flight. Charles spoke softly, as though afraid a louder sound might shatter the moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" Laura looked away. Because you wouldn't have listened. You never listened to him. Why would you listen to me? He took a step forward, but she raised a hand. Don't, she said. Grace doesn't know who you are. She only knows her father died a hero. That's enough. I'm not here to take anything, Charles said, the words spilling faster now. I just needed to understand, to see her, to tell you I'm— A small voice interrupted him. Mommy? Grace appeared from behind the doorframe, still in her pajamas, clutching a wooden bird painted in soft blue. Her eyes flicked from her mother to Charles. Recognition dawned slowly, a quiet joy spreading across her face. It's you, she said, smiling. The man from the cemetery. Charles knelt instinctively, his voice barely steady. Yes, Grace, it's me. Laura reached for her daughter's shoulder, but the child stepped closer. Did you come to visit Daddy again? He swallowed hard. I came to see you. Grace tilted her head, studying him the way children do when they sense a truth adults can't hide. You look sad again. He smiled faintly. Maybe not as much as before. Laura's voice trembled. Grace, go inside. Get your sweater. But Mom, now. Grace obeyed reluctantly, glancing back as she disappeared down the hallway. Charles rose slowly. The silence between him and Laura was heavy, filled with years that could not be reclaimed. She's a beautiful child, he said finally. Laura folded her arms. She's my whole world. He nodded. I can see that. She hesitated, then asked quietly, What do you want, Mr. Whitmore? He met her eyes, tired, proud, guarded. I want to make things right. Her expression hardened. You can't. Michael's gone. And Grace, she doesn't need the Whitmore name hanging over her. I'm not here for names, he said gently. Only truth. Laura shook her head, tears glinting but unshed. Truth doesn't change the past. He looked toward the small drawing on the wall, the bird with open wings. No, he said softly, but maybe it can give it a home. The faint sound of footsteps signaled Grace's return. Laura opened the door wider but stood in the frame, blocking his way. Please go, she whispered. Before she starts asking questions I can't answer. Charles hesitated, then nodded. If that's what you want. Grace peeked from behind her mother, clutching the blue bird. Will you come back, mister? She asked. Charles's throat tightened. If your mother says I can. The little girl smiled, unbothered by the tension adults could not disguise. Okay, I'll keep your secret, she said proudly, as though promising a game. Charles almost laughed through the ache in his chest. Thank you, Grace. He turned and walked down the steps. The wind caught the edge of his coat, lifting it slightly like a wing. From behind him, he heard Laura's soft sob and the click of the door closing. As he reached the street, Walter's car pulled up. He paused for a moment, looking back at the house, a modest place, full of life, full of what he had never understood until too late. Everything all right, sir? Walter asked as he opened the door. Charles stared at the small window where a child's hand now waved against the glass. Not yet, he said quietly, but maybe it will be. He climbed into the car, holding the folded letter tighter in his coat pocket, unaware that this single meeting had already begun to rewrite the years he thought were lost forever. As the car pulled away from South Point Avenue, Charles couldn't look back. The door had closed gently, but it sounded final, like the shutting of a memory he had no right to reopen. Rain began again, soft against the windshield. Walter drove in silence, sensing his employer's turmoil. You found them, he said quietly. Yes, Charles murmured. And lost them again, in the same hour. When they stopped at a red light, Charles caught his reflection in the glass, an old man, hollow-eyed, clutching the same regrets he'd carried for decades. She hates me, he whispered. Walter shook his head. No, sir. She's protecting what's left of her peace. Give her time. Charles turned toward the window. On the sidewalk, a mother lifted her child onto her shoulders, both laughing as the rain came harder. The sight ached in him ordinary love, something he'd never learned how to hold. Back at the mansion, he went straight to his study. The air smelled of old paper and silence. He opened the desk drawer and took out the wooden bird he'd brought home from the cemetery. Its tiny carved feathers caught the lamplight, still rough beneath his thumb. He placed it beside Michael's photograph. She looks like you, he whispered. Same eyes, same courage. For a long moment, he simply stood there, a man surrounded by everything money could buy and nothing that mattered. Then he folded his hands, bowed his head, and said softly, "Tomorrow, I'll try again." Outside, thunder rolled over the lake. Somewhere in Englewood, a little girl was falling asleep, holding a blue bird in her hand, never knowing that the man she met at the grave had already begun to change. That night, sleep refused to come. The rain had stopped, but the sound of dripping water from the eaves kept a slow rhythm outside Charles's window, a rhythm that seemed to echo his thoughts. He sat in his study, surrounded by the soft glow of a single lamp, the room heavy with silence and unfinished words. On the desk lay the box he hadn't touched in years. He drew it closer, his fingers trembling as he lifted the lid. Inside were old medals, photographs, and a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. He untied them carefully, like handling relics from another life. The first letter was dated 8 years ago, the last one Michael had ever sent before deployment. The paper smelled faintly of smoke and rain. Charles unfolded it, his eyes tracing the words as though reading the voice of his own past. "Dad, I know we argue. You wanted me to inherit your world, and I wanted to build my own. But if anything happens, please know I never hated you. I just hoped you'd one day see people not as assets, but as hearts that beat like yours." The words blurred as his eyes filled. For the first time, he read every line to the end. "There's someone I wish you could meet someday. Her name is Laura. She makes the world quiet when it feels too loud. I think you'd like her if you look past the things that divide us." Charles set the paper down and pressed his palms against his face. He remembered the last time he'd seen Michael that night in the hallway. Voices raised, pride slicing through love. "You're throwing your life away for a maid," he had said. And Michael's answer had been soft, almost pitying. "At least I'm throwing it towards something that matters." He had never told anyone those words, not even his late wife, who had died believing their son was a hero untouched by conflict. But now, alone in the quiet, he realized that Michael had been fighting 2 wars, one overseas and one here, in the house built by his father's ego. Charles reached for the next envelope. The handwriting was smaller, almost rushed. It wasn't addressed to him. The name read, "Laura Bennett, care of Oakwood Housing Unit." His breath caught. He hesitated, then unfolded it. "Laura, if I don't come back, promise me you'll tell our child the truth, not about who I was, but about what I believed. Tell them people can change, even the ones who hurt you. Tell them to forgive me for leaving before I learned how to live." The letter trembled in his hands. He leaned back, closing his eyes, hearing his son's voice echo in the quiet, steady, forgiving, alive. The grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight. The sound rolled through the empty rooms like a heartbeat. Charles stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the dark city. The lake glimmered faintly in the distance. He thought of Laura, of how she had looked at him with both anger and grief. He thought of Grace, the little girl with her father's smile, holding a bird carved from hope. He whispered, "Michael, I failed you in life. Maybe I can honor you in what's left of mine." On the desk, he placed both letters side by side, one for a father who hadn't listened, one for a woman who had believed despite everything. For the first time in decades, Charles felt the weight of his wealth shrink beneath something far heavier, understanding. He picked up the old fountain pen lying next to the letters and began to write, slowly, deliberately, his voice silent but his heart speaking through every stroke. "Laura, you don't owe me forgiveness. But if my son loved you, then the least I can do is listen to what I ignored for years. Tell me what you need for Grace, for the home you lost, for the peace he wanted for all of us." He paused, staring at the ink still wet on the page. Outside, the city hummed faintly distant sirens, a train horn, the wind against the trees. But inside, for the first time in a long time, Charles Whitmore felt a kind of peace that didn't come from silence, but from the sound of truth finally being spoken. He folded the letter carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and sealed it with shaking hands. Tomorrow, he decided, he would deliver it himself. The next morning, pale light filtered through the lace curtains. Charles sat in the back of the car, holding the sealed letter in his coat pocket like something alive. The city moved past him, coffee shops opening, buses hissing at corners, joggers waving to one another in the early chill. Ordinary life. It looked simple. It wasn't. Back to Inglewood, sir? Walter asked gently. Charles nodded. Yes, but stopped 2 blocks before the address. When they arrived, he stepped out alone, letter in hand. The neighborhood smelled of wet pavement and toast. A small boy raced by on a scooter, laughing. Across the street, a church bell rang slow, steady, merciful. He climbed the steps to Laura's building again. For a long moment, he just stood there, uncertain if he had the right to knock twice. Finally, he placed the envelope against the doorframe, pressing it flat so the morning wind wouldn't take it. From inside came faint voices, a woman humming, a child's laugh. He smiled sadly. That's what home sounds like, he whispered. He turned to go, but the door opened. Laura stood there in her house sweater, surprise softening her face. Mr. Whitmore? He froze. I didn't want to intrude, he said quickly. I wanted to give you this. He held out the letter. It's from me, for you and Grace. She looked at the envelope but didn't take it right away. What could you possibly say that time hasn't already said for you? Maybe nothing, he admitted. But I needed to say it anyway. The hesitation in her eyes shifted not forgiveness, not yet, but curiosity. She took the letter gently. I'll read it, she said. He nodded. That's all I ask. Behind her, Grace appeared again, holding the blue wooden bird. Hi, mister, she said shyly. Did you come back to visit Daddy? Charles smiled through the ache in his chest. Not today, sweetheart. Today I came to visit you. Grace grinned, proud. Mom said you used to know Daddy a long time ago. I did, he said softly, and I'm still trying to know him. Laura's eyes flicked toward him, unreadable. Come by tomorrow, she said quietly, almost against her will. We'll talk. Charles nodded, barely breathing. Tomorrow. He stepped back, tipping his hat like a man decades younger. Grace waved from the doorway, the wooden bird held high like a flag of truce. As Charles walked away, the autumn air bit at his face, but his heart felt lighter. For the first time, the path behind him didn't look like loss, it looked like the road home. The following morning, Chicago was wrapped in a quiet mist, the kind that softened the city's sharp edges and made even the busiest streets feel like memories. Charles Whitmore hadn't slept much. He had sat most of the night in his study, replaying Laura's words, the sound of Grace's laughter, and the way the morning light had touched their doorway like forgiveness waiting on the threshold. He left early, before Walter even had his first coffee. The Rolls-Royce glided through empty streets toward the south side. The sky was still gray-blue, the lake a mirror of silver light. Charles rested one hand on the window frame, his reflection faint against the moving city. He didn't feel like the man who had once built skyscrapers. He felt like a man crossing an invisible bridge one step at a time, afraid to look down. When he reached Inglewood, Laura was already outside sweeping the porch. She looked up, surprised. You're early, Charles smiled faintly. I've had enough of waiting. Laura set the broom aside, folding her arms. Grace is still asleep. That's all right, he said. I didn't come to see her this time. She tilted her head. Then, why are you here? He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded paper, a copy of Michael's letter to her, the one he had found among his son's things. He wrote this for you, Charles said softly. He wanted you to know he loved you, and that he never stopped believing in what you had together. Laura took the paper, her hand trembling. She looked at the familiar handwriting, strong, hurried, hopeful. Her lips parted, but no words came. I didn't read it until last night, Charles continued. I should have years ago. If I had, maybe he'd have come home differently. Maybe I would have. Laura's voice was barely a whisper.
You can't change what happened.
I know, he said, but I can stop repeating it. They stood in silence, the morning chill between them slowly giving way to something warmer, not forgiveness yet, but understanding. She sighed, glancing toward the horizon. There's a small bridge near the park. Michael used to go there when he needed to think. Said it made him feel closer to peace. Charles nodded. Will you take me there? Laura hesitated, then nodded once. Give me a minute to wake Grace. She'll want to come. A few minutes later, the three of them walked side by side through the narrow streets. Grace skipped ahead, the bluebird swinging from her hand, humming softly to herself. The air smelled of fallen leaves and the faint sweetness of maple syrup from a nearby diner. They reached the bridge, an old wooden structure stretching over a narrow creek. Morning light glinted on the water, turning it to gold. Grace leaned on the railing, peering at the ripples below. "Mom says Daddy used to feed the ducks here," she said. Charles nodded. "He did. He brought me once, when he was little." Laura looked at him sharply, surprised. "He never told me that." Charles smiled sadly. "It was before the arguments, before the business took everything good out of me. He used to bring breadcrumbs in his pockets, said the ducks liked him better than me." Grace giggled. "Maybe they did." Laura smiled faintly despite herself. The moment hung fragile and real, a quiet bridge between past and present. Charles reached into his coat again and pulled out a small pouch. He opened it, revealing the wooden dove that had become a symbol of everything lost and found. "He made this with his own hands," Charles said, handing it to Grace. "And I think he'd want you to keep it safe." Grace's eyes widened. "I already have one. This one's from the grave." "This," he said softly, "is its twin." She turned the bird over in her small hands, tracing the carved feathers. "So now they're together again," she said, smiling. Laura watched silently, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He used to say that," she whispered. "Whenever he fixed something broken, now they're together again." "Oh." Charles leaned on the railing, his hands trembling slightly. "Maybe it's time we stopped running, Laura. For Grace's sake. For Michael's." Laura didn't answer right away. She looked at Grace carefree, innocent, the sunlight in her hair. Then she looked back at Charles, seeing not the tycoon who had once terrified her, but a man weathered by loss, softened by regret. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said quietly. He nodded. "You don't have to. Just let me try to be better than I was." Grace turned toward them, her smile bright and certain. "Can we feed the ducks now?" Charles let out a shaky laugh. "Yes, sweetheart. Let's feed the ducks." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of breadcrumbs Walter had thoughtfully packed, and scattered them across the water. The ducks came almost immediately, a dozen of them gliding gracefully toward the bridge, quacking softly. Grace clapped her hands, delighted. "See? They still like you, Grandpa." The word hung in the air unplanned, pure and heavy with meaning. Charles froze. Laura looked up, startled, but Grace didn't notice. She was too busy laughing at the ducks. For the first time in years, Charles felt tears sting his eyes, not from grief, but from something brighter, something fragile and alive. He whispered, "Thank you, Grace." The sunlight broke through the mist, and for a fleeting moment, the world felt whole again. They stayed on the bridge long after the ducks had gone. The morning light softened to gold, warming the wooden planks beneath their feet. Grace sat on the railing, swinging her legs, humming a tune only she knew. Laura leaned quietly against the post, arms crossed, her gaze distant. "She called you Grandpa," she said after a while. Charles smiled faintly. "I heard. She doesn't understand what that means yet." "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "But I do." But Laura looked down at the water. "It doesn't erase anything, you know. The anger, the hurt." "I wouldn't want it to," he said gently. "Those things are part of the truth too. But maybe they don't have to be the end of it." The breeze caught Laura's hair, brushing a strand across her cheek. She didn't move to fix it. "Michael used to stand right there," she said softly, pointing to the far side of the bridge. "Said this place made him feel close to God. I never understood that until now." And Charles followed her gaze. The water glimmered like glass. "I think he's here," he whispered. For a moment, neither spoke. The world was quiet, except for the sound of the creek and the faint whistle of a passing train. Grace turned toward them, holding up the two wooden birds. "Look, Grandpa," she said proudly. "They fit together like a heart." He knelt beside her. "They do, sweetheart." He gently pressed the birds side by side, the carved wings touching. "Your daddy made sure of that." "Em?" Grace beamed, the reflection of sunlight dancing in her eyes. "Can we come here every Sunday?" Charles hesitated, then looked at Laura. She met his eyes for the first time without fear. "We'll see," she said quietly, her tone soft but not dismissive. Grace smiled as though that were a promise. When they left the bridge, Charles lingered behind for a moment. He looked out at the slow-moving water, at the ripples spreading outward like memories refusing to fade. He whispered into the morning air, "I'm trying, Michael, I swear I'm trying." The breeze lifted his words and carried them across the creek, scattering them like breadcrumbs for unseen wings. Back at the car, Walter opened the door, but said nothing. He saw the change on his employer's face, not peace exactly, but something close to it. "Sir?" he asked softly. Charles placed a hand on the roof of the car, glancing once more toward the bridge where Laura and Grace were walking away hand in hand. "Let's take the long road home, Walter," he said. "I'd like to see the city wake up." As the car rolled forward, the morning sun broke fully through the mist, washing the skyline in light. And for the first time in many years, Charles Whitmore felt as though he was finally crossing the right bridge, not toward success, but toward forgiveness. Autumn settled fully over Chicago, the city wrapped in shades of rust and gold. Days grew shorter, and the air carried that sweet ache of endings. Charles Whitmore spent his mornings walking through Lincoln Park, now something he hadn't done in years. The leaves crunched beneath his shoes, and for once, he didn't hurry. He carried a paper bag of breadcrumbs in his coat pocket, a small ritual that always made him smile. Every Sunday, he returned to Inglewood. It started with brief visits, a few words exchanged with Laura on the porch, a cup of coffee offered awkwardly, a cautious smile from Grace. But as weeks passed, those visits grew longer. Grace began waiting by the window when she saw the black car approaching, and Laura no longer hid her uncertainty behind cold politeness. One afternoon, as the air turned crisp and the church bells chimed in the distance, Grace ran to him the moment he stepped out of the car. "Grandpa," she cried, holding out a small paper. "I drew us." Charles took the crayon, drawing 3 figures on a bridge, the sun rising behind them, 2 little birds flying overhead. His chest tightened. "You're quite the artist," he said, his voice warm. Laura stood at the door, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "She's been waiting all morning for you." "I didn't want to be late," he said, smiling. "Good," Laura replied, her voice softer now. "Because we saved you some pie." "Oh." Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and apples. Grace set 3 plates on the table while Laura poured coffee into mismatched mugs. Charles watched them quietly, the small domestic gestures that filled the air with something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. "Do you still live in that big house?" Grace asked between bites. He nodded. "I do, but it's awfully quiet these days. Maybe you need a cat," she suggested seriously. Laura laughed a real laugh, not the guarded smile he'd seen before. "Or company," she said, glancing at him. Charles met her gaze and returned the smile. "That too." After lunch, Grace ran outside to play with the neighborhood kids, leaving them alone. The quiet between them wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like a conversation waiting to begin. "She talks about him a lot," Laura said, looking out the window. "Michael, she remembers things I never told her. The way he laughed. The way he used to whistle while he worked." Charles nodded slowly. "I think some things find their way through blood." Laura looked down at her hands. "I used to hate you, you know, for what you did to him, for the way you made him doubt himself." He didn't flinch. "You were right to. But then you kept showing up," she said quietly. "And it's hard to keep hating someone who keeps showing up." "Oh." Charles leaned back, the weight of her words settling over him like a fragile mercy. "I can't undo what I was," he said. "But maybe I can still become the man my son hoped I'd be." Laura looked at him for a long moment, searching for the man she used to fear and not finding him. "You're getting there," she said finally. Outside, the sound of children's laughter carried through the crisp air, mixing with the smell of baked apples and distant chiming bells. It felt, for once, like the world was forgiving itself, quietly, slowly, honestly. Grace burst through the door, cheeks pink from the cold. "Grandpa, come see. We made leaf crowns." Charles rose, smiling. "How could I miss that?" As she dragged him outside, Laura lingered at the doorway, watching them, the old man in his dark coat kneeling beside the child in her paper crown, both laughing beneath a tree that had already begun to lose its leaves. It was a simple moment, but something inside her shifted not quite forgiveness, but the echo of it, clear and lasting. That evening, the Whitmore mansion didn't feel so empty. The fire crackled in the study, casting warm light across the photographs on the mantel. For the first time, one of them was new, a picture Laura had taken that afternoon. Grace was in the center, leaves in her hair, and Charles was laughing beside her, truly laughing. He poured a cup of tea, not whiskey, and sat by the window. The city lights shimmered on the lake, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 8. He thought about Michael, how his son had once stood on that bridge, believing in things his father couldn't see. He whispered, "You were right, son. It's never too late to start again." The next Sunday, he returned to Inglewood, but this time without the heavy coat or the old guilt that used to follow him like a shadow. Laura greeted him on the porch, her voice calm. "Grace is at choir practice. She'll be home soon. I can wait," he said with a gentle smile. She nodded toward the kitchen. "Then have some coffee. I don't keep the fancy kind. It'll taste better than anything I've had in years," he replied. They sat together in quiet companionship, the sound of the kettle filling the space between words. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was peace, the first fragile piece of it, built cup by cup, Sunday by Sunday. When Grace came home, she ran into the kitchen, waving a small paper heart she'd made at church. "This is for all 3 of us," she said proudly, "because families don't have to be perfect. They just have to stay." Laura looked at Charles, her eyes softening. "She gets that from her father, and maybe a little from her grandfather," he said quietly. They shared a small, real smile, the kind that said, "We're still here." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint sound of laughter from a nearby park. It was the kind of evening that didn't demand closure, only gratitude. And for Charles Whitmore, that was enough. By December, the city had turned white. Snow lined the rooftops, and the air smelled faintly of pine and chimney smoke. Charles Whitmore stood in front of the toy store window, watching a train circle endlessly on its tiny track. Families hurried past with bright scarves and laughter, and he smiled, no longer a stranger to that sound. At home in Inglewood, Grace was writing a letter to Santa with fierce concentration, her tongue sticking out just a little as she worked. "Mom," she called, "do you think Santa knows Grandpa's house?" Laura glanced up from the kitchen, amused. "I think he can find any house with a good heart in it." When Charles arrived later that afternoon, snowflakes clung to his coat. Grace ran to him, waving her letter. "We're making a Christmas wish list. You have to add yours." He chuckled. "At my age, I don't need many things, sweetheart." "Then wish for someone else," she said seriously. He thought for a moment. "All right, I'll wish for a little more time to make things right." Laura handed him a mug of cocoa. "That's a good wish," she said softly. "Michael would have liked that." Outside, the first Christmas lights flickered on. Inside, warmth and laughter filled the small house, fragile, real, and bright against the cold. For the first time in decades, Charles Whitmore didn't dread winter. He welcomed it. It meant another season to keep his promise. Christmas Eve came quietly. Snow fell in slow, lazy spirals, covering the streets in silver. At Laura's small house, a faint glow from the windows spilled onto the front steps. Inside, the scent of pine and baked cookies filled the air. Grace sat cross-legged by the tree, carefully hanging a paper ornament shaped like 2 tiny birds. "This one's for Daddy," she whispered, "and this one's for Grandpa." Charles stood nearby, helping her tie the ribbon. "He'd like that, sweetheart. You've made this house brighter than any tower I ever built." "Embry," Laura smiled from the kitchen doorway, her eyes soft. "You sound like Michael when you say things like that." He looked up at her, the light of the tree flickering across his face. "Then maybe I'm finally learning from the right teacher." After dinner, they all stepped outside. The neighborhood shimmered with lights and laughter, neighbors singing carols, children tossing snowballs. Grace slipped her hand into Charles's glove and said, "Promise you'll always come back next Christmas." He bent down, his breath misting in the cold. "I promise, Grace. Every Christmas, every winter, I'll be right here." Laura watched them, her heart tightening and softening all at once. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt earned. As the church bells rang midnight, Charles looked toward the snowy sky. For the first time, he whispered not a prayer of regret, but of gratitude for second chances, for family, for love that outlived loss. And when Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, he understood that this, not wealth, not redemption, but this quiet moment was the true miracle of Christmas. By early spring, the snow had melted from the sidewalks, leaving behind the faint scent of wet earth and renewal. The world seemed to breathe again, and so did Charles Whitmore. He had begun spending more time in Inglewood than in his mansion. The grand house by the lake, once filled with silence, now felt like a museum of his mistakes. But Laura's small home with its creaky floors, coffee-stained table, and the sound of Grace humming that place felt like life. On a bright Saturday morning, Grace tugged his sleeve. "Grandpa, our school's having Family Day next week. You have to come." Charles blinked, surprised. "Family Day?" Laura smiled over her coffee. "It's just a small event. Songs, crafts, too much lemonade." But she's been talking about it for weeks. He looked at Grace's hopeful eyes and nodded. "Then I wouldn't miss it for the world." The week passed quickly. On the morning of Family Day, Charles arrived early, carrying a paper bag full of cookies he had baked himself slightly uneven, a little burnt on the edges, but made with care. When he entered the schoolyard, he hesitated. Parents chatted in clusters. Children ran about. He felt strangely out of place until Grace spotted him and ran over, her voice bright. "He's here! My grandpa's here!" The words broke something open inside him. He knelt to hug her, the sound of laughter rising all around. Laura joined them a moment later, smiling quietly. "You really baked those?" she asked, lifting an eyebrow. "I might have had help from Walter," he admitted. Grace grinned. "They smell funny but taste good." The morning passed in laughter and music. Grace sang with her classmates, her voice clear and proud. When the children were asked to bring up family members to join a final song, Grace grabbed both their hands, one small, one worn, and pulled them onto the stage. Charles stood between Laura and Grace, sunlight on his face, the crowd clapping to the rhythm. He had never looked smaller, yet never felt larger. As the song ended, Grace squeezed his hand and whispered, "We did it." He smiled. "Yes, we did." For the first time in years, Charles Whitmore didn't think about what he'd lost. He thought about what he'd found and what he still had time to give. The air that evening carried the scent of spring-damp soil, lilacs, and the faint sweetness of cut grass. The sky glowed in gentle hues of gold and rose, the kind of light that made even the worn porches and narrow streets of Inglewood look soft and forgiving. Charles, Laura, and Grace walked home from the school, still holding hands. Grace skipped between them, swinging their arms as she went. The medal from Family Day gleamed proudly against her chest. "Now everyone knows we're a family," she said with a grin that could melt any remaining distance between them. Charles smiled, his voice quiet. "You're right, sweetheart. Everyone knows." They reached the little house, its front porch bathed in amber light. Grace ran ahead to hang her medal on the door handle like a banner of victory. "There, now the whole neighborhood will see." Laura laughed softly. "You might just start a new tradition, honey." Charles stood back for a moment, watching them, mother and daughter, framed by the doorway's light. It struck him how simple love could look when stripped of pride and fear. No boardrooms, no marble floors, just a porch, laughter, and a child's joy. Laura turned to him. "You don't have to keep driving from the lake every time, you know. There's a small house for rent down the street. Old, but cozy." He hesitated, searching her face. "Are you sure you'd want me that close?" She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held both forgiveness and warning. "Grace already decided for both of us." He chuckled quietly, eyes warm. "Then I suppose I'll take it." The words settled between them, light, but full of promise. Later that night, the neighborhood grew quiet. From the living room window, Charles could see the glow of the street lamp touching the swing set in the yard. Laura had gone to bed. Grace had fallen asleep on the couch before she could finish her bedtime story. The television played softly, muted a warm hum in an otherwise still room. Charles sat alone on the porch, a cup of tea cooling in his hands. Above him, the stars began to pierce through the faint haze of city light. For years, he had stared at skyscrapers and thought success meant reaching higher. Now, sitting on this wooden step, he realized life had been asking him to go lower, to kneel, to listen, to love. He whispered into the quiet, "You were right, Michael. All along." A few moments later, the door creaked open. Grace padded out, her hair messy from sleep, clutching her pillow. "You're not leaving, are you?" she mumbled, eyes heavy. He smiled, setting the cup aside. "Not tonight." She climbed into his lap without another word, curling against his chest. "Mom says when people love you, they don't always say it. Sometimes they just stay." Charles wrapped his arms around her gently, his voice trembling with truth. "Then I'll stay." The porch light buzzed softly above them. Somewhere down the street, a train passed, its faint whistle fading into the night. Laura stood quietly at the doorway, watching her hand resting on the frame, eyes glistening in the dim light. Inside the house, on the mantel above the fireplace, two wooden birds sat side by side, wings almost touching. The smaller one bore new paint now, a soft blue to match the other. Grace had done it herself. As the wind rustled the curtains, the carved wings seemed to shift slightly, as if catching a breath of air together at last. Charles looked toward them through the open door and smiled. For the first time, he didn't see a memorial. He saw a beginning. He whispered, "I'm home." And in that quiet, beneath a spring sky filled with stars and forgiveness, that truth, simple, unspoken, eternal, became his final redemption. The evening light faded softly over the quiet streets of Inglewood, and the sound of laughter drifted faintly from a small porch where 3 generations sat side by side. It wasn't the laughter of wealth or victory, but of peace, the kind that comes when the heart finally learns to forgive. Charles Whitmore had spent a lifetime chasing skyscrapers and silence, yet his true legacy had always been waiting in a modest house with a little girl who called him Grandpa. Sometimes, redemption doesn't arrive with thunder or applause. It comes quietly in a cup of coffee shared, in a child's drawing hung proudly on a fridge, in the courage to say, "I'll stay." For Charles, that simple promise became the bridge between who he was and who he could still be. The lesson is simple, but it's one we often forget. Love and kindness have the power to rebuild what time and pride once tore apart. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about learning to live gently with it. Just as a porch light shines each night for those returning home, a small act of compassion can light the darkest roads of our lives. In the rhythm of everyday America, the smell of apple pie cooling on a kitchen counter, the Sunday chatter after church, the soft hum of a radio before bedtime, there's a quiet truth. Happiness doesn't belong to those who have everything, but to those who finally understand what truly matters. So tonight, as you sit in your favorite chair or walk past the old oak tree in your yard, think of Charles, Laura, and Grace, a family rebuilt not by blood or fortune, but by faith in one another. Because every heart, no matter how broken, deserves a place to come home to. If this story touched you, type 1" the comments. If you think it could be told better, press 0 and share your thoughts. Your voice helps us grow. And if this little story found its way to your heart, maybe share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to start again. Before we go, may peace and kindness stay with you like that porch light that never goes out, waiting for love to find its way home.